On today's episode, we will be discussing the housing market and giving an understanding of why housing is so expensive. I'm Braden, he's Jordan, and together we are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview. All right. Hey, Jordan. How's it going?
Not too bad, man. How you doing?
Yeah. Doing well. I appreciate you taking some time for another episode. It's technically we'll give a little behind the scenes. This is our repeat of this episode because we had some technical difficulties, but nevertheless, we're going to get it done. And hopefully it'll be just as good, if not better, than the first time we recorded it. Well, Jordan, I want to start this episode off with a bit of a question, which hopefully should be pretty obvious because I'm putting you on the spot here. But what is likely the largest expense you will ever have to make in your entire life?
Oh. Okay, there's two.
Okay.
I'm thinking of. One's going to be the main one, but the other one's kind of one like I always forget about. But now that I'm thinking about it, like you're trying to make it like sound like professional. But
you don't need to do
but
that
your shelter.
Yeah, okay.
Like that,
so
that
housing,
in your retirement
right?
or you're too big. Yeah.
Yeah. So planning for retirement and housing, right? Sheltered housing, and you can use those words interchangeably, and you could make the argument, the amount of money that you save for retirement tends to be related to your housing, right? Like if you go to a retirement home, nursing home, all those things, those can get very expensive.
Yeah.
But the answer that I was hoping that you'd give, and you did give it, is housing, right?
Yeah.
Housing tends to be unless you own, I guess, like your own business and something along the lines of that, housing for the mass majority of people is going to be the largest expense that they ever make.
Yeah,
right?
in the developed, like this, for what, 100%.
Yeah. I would maybe even make the argument, I don't know this for certain, but in areas that are still quote-unquote developing, there's probably a good chance that even their houses are still going to be one of their larger expenses. It might just be on a different scale than what we're talking about here. But
geography could play a role in that or whatever. But
yeah, and obviously there are always going to be those ongoing expenses. Maybe I should have made things a little bit more specific. The like kind of one-time expense, if that makes sense, right? Like food. That's you're going to have to eat for the rest of your life. Yeah. That's going to be kind of expensive.
Yeah, that might be
right?
one of the few that runs neck and neck.
Yeah, right?
Because those are the two things you need.
Yeah, right? It's those necessities, right? But in terms of a one-time lump sum, if you're trying to buy a house right now or something like that, it's going to be the largest expense, right? Cars are sometimes considered a pretty large expense, but for the price of a car, you can buy... for a price of a house, I should say, you could buy several cars, right? So it is quite a massive expense, and it's crazy, and we've kind of already talked about it, but that it's one of the largest expenses, but it's also something that is a necessity for us to be able to live, right? It's funny that's the there's always, what is it, like kind of food, shelter, water, and like clothing. Would that be like kind of the four major necessities of life?
Yeah,
right?
I'd say so.
So it makes sense from a demand standpoint, right? But it's also kind of crazy that it's so important, yet
it's our largest
have
expenditure.
a huge barrier. Sorry, what was that?
It's so important, but it's like your biggest, it's the thing you have to worry about the most, basically.
Right? Yeah, it's the one thing that we're not kind of taking care of in any capacity. I apologize if anyone can hear my dog barking. I think someone came to the door. And there's no way that my wife is getting up with a 1-month-old and our 3-year-old. So there's a good chance that she's just going to keep barking.
Well, that stranger's just going to think nobody's home, so it's good for everybody.
Yeah, there you go, right? But yeah, nevertheless, right? It is a pretty crazy thing that housing is it's the most expensive thing, and it's up there with being one of the most important of those necessities,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, food and water are gonna you need that even more than shelter potentially, but you get the
Well, yeah, and
idea.
we take it for granted a little here because of all the space we have, right?
Yeah, yeah,
We go
for
to you
sure.
go to Europe, and it's like it's something it's not any less important, but it's
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
but the
You
limitations
can't
are even
escape like
greater.
the fact that it's all around you all the time, right? Whereas here, you
Definitely.
drive up north, and it's like, oh, it's nice, big,
Yeah, I was gonna say you can see some wide open spaces
yeah,
depending on where you're looking, right? Yeah, and North America, I would argue as a whole benefits from that, where there is some spaces that are still
yeah. So it's like, oh, we can always
not as
fit more houses, kind of thing. Whereas like other places, like, where are we gonna put more houses?
yeah, yeah, totally. And like I think like kind of going off that, right? Like I think it's fair to say around the world, housing, like whether we're talking about Europe or we're talking about North America or parts of Asia or just everywhere, right? Um, Housing is one of the most expensive costs that we end up
Yeah.
facing. And even in places, well, really, like in places like where we live in Toronto and the GTA, right? Because anywhere that's a high demand area, I guess, the expense can be so great that people aren't even able to find a place to live,
Yeah.
right? Like you might be completely priced out of the
Well, and
market.
it's becoming a widespread problem. Like, not even just here.
Yeah,
Like, you got certain states are starting to have an issue with that.
definitely. Yeah. I think if you looked anywhere in the world and said there's demand for what people to want to live there, right? Then housing is going to be that big expense issue
Yeah.
where um, you can't find a house within the like kind of a reasonable budget
Yeah.
relative to
What
the average
your
person's
earning is,
salaries.
yeah.
Yeah, right. And it again, it scales differently depending on where you live, but I think the same notion is true, right? Like you can, I don't know, go to Ireland and it'd be the same situation as it is in Toronto, right? Like I know Toronto is is a city, but like whatever, Dublin, I don't
Yeah.
know, name a major city around the world, and it would be this same situation that the surrounding areas and that metropolitan has huge housing demands, and in a lot of cases, the demand is
We're
outweighing
not building them
the
fast
actual.
enough, yeah.
Yeah, right. Um, and so, of course, even when you have a situation like that, and housing becomes so far out of reach, right, for people, um, inevitably that causes a chain reaction that really just affects society as a whole, right? Even if you are someone that has a house, um, if you live in an area that uh, doesn't have enough housing, so to speak, for people to actually purchase for themselves, um, regardless of your own personal situation, that the impact of that lack of housing is going to affect how your kind of community works, right? Um, and we're going to go into a lot of like I guess like details or examples and stuff like that. So I don't want to get too far into it, but yeah, I hope people right off the bat are able to see, and if you aren't, hopefully by the end of this episode you'll be able to see how whether you own a house or not, the lack of housing is going to affect how you live your life.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings us to today's topic, right? The idea of housing and the housing market, and in particular, why houses are so expensive, right? So there are a few different factors that play into and influence the housing market. Um, I'm not necessarily going to go into them in any particular order, right? Like there's not necessarily that one is more important than the other. I think it's the combination of all these
Just
things that really um, play into why why things can be so
the
difficult.
landscape of it,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, but depending on, I guess, where you live, certain ones of these or certain certain ones of these factors. I don't know. That's not English. Some of these factors will play more into why your housing costs are so expensive than others, right?
Yeah.
But let's just get into it. I think the first one that I wanted to really touch upon, because we've already kind of talked about it in previous episodes, but of course it's banking,
Yeah.
right?
That's like a huge part of it.
Yeah. Banking, of course, is a huge part of the housing market. It's not necessarily always thought of that way. But anyone who is looking to buy a house, unless you are extremely wealthy or you are lucky enough to find a place that you can buy in cash, you are probably buying that house on a loan, aka a mortgage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's the majority of the population, right?
Yeah, right? Because I think even, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think even if you went to like a remote place, so to speak, and wanted to buy a place, odds are, unless you were coming there with a bunch of money, if that's the place that you live and grow up and are wanting to buy a house, the jobs that are available to you there are not necessarily going to allow you to buy that house in cash.
Yep.
At least in today's society.
Yeah, because
right?
I was reading a weird statistic. It has nothing to do with it. Well, when I was reading it, it had nothing.
Yeah,
but it does have something to do. This is, I can't remember the percentage number, but it was like above 80% of people are like where you're born. You spend your entire life within a 25-mile radius of that area.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's like I think it's like 80% of like human
people.
Population. Yeah.
It's
I know it could be somewhere in
that.
around. This is like I was reading like a month or two ago, but it's like you think about it, yeah. So that exactly like, to your point is like you have to work with what's available around you, right?
Yeah, you're almost like your cost of living is going to scale relative to where you live, right?
Yeah.
Like if you live somewhere remote, the cost of living is going to have like
the job diversity is going to be less too, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of jobs are worse either.
100%, right?
Because like if you're working in a diamond mine where there's not a lot of people, then it's like
yes, right? Yeah. Like so you could have a good job, but it's also even just depending on how remote it is, maybe to get the basic goods that you need, that has huge costs, right? Like to like bring in food and bring in I don't know, whatever, right? Like those have extra costs with it. And so there are other parts of your salary getting eaten up by other aspects of life, right? So that even that house that like I guess like if you want to give some context, right? Like for you and I to buy houses nowadays, for nothing special, like what I would consider like starter
run
homes.
Of the mill,
yeah. You're getting probably for most of the GTA close to $1 million.
Yeah,
right. Maybe off by like maybe it's 700, 800,
2-bathroom,
right?
like
nothing crazy.
Maybe square feet at the most, like nothing fancy.
Yeah. I think if you're looking at an 1,800 square foot house in Toronto, Toronto, I'm not even going to go down that road, but even just the GTA, right? Like,
well, if you have that much square footage, you probably won't have parking.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah,
not included with that fee.
100%, right? But yeah, nevertheless, right? Like the cost would go up quite a bit, and then if you had a situation where you lived a little bit more remote, and maybe you're lucky enough that the demand is not necessarily there quite as much, and you can buy a house for $100,000-$200,000, I would make the argument that even those people, for the most part, are still probably buying those houses on a mortgage, right?
Yeah.
And historically, that hasn't always been the case, right? It used to be, like back in the day, and I mean going way back, you could buy a house without a mortgage, right?
Yeah, you just needed a land deed from I guess it would have been like
you still have to Yeah. Well, so that's actually a good point, right? Like there were a lot of also people who um, built their own houses, right? Like you could used to get, I think it was like, uh, I don't know when, but like Sears used to like sell like houses that you could buy, like modular houses
That was
almost,
in the
right?
50s.
Like the
Yeah.
50s, right? Yeah. And so in a situation like that, you weren't necessarily getting a bank loan to be able
No.
to
And it's crazy because, like, a
build
generation
that house.
before that, like, they wouldn't even have needed the blueprints to know how to do it
No, it was
for the
just
most part.
that
Yeah.
yeah, you found build your homestead,
Yeah.
right? Type of thing.
Exactly.
Um, so when banks kind of came along um, with a bit of a, I guess, in the incentive slash the means to encourage um, loans for people to be able to buy a house.
Yeah.
The incentive, of course, was all right. I want to make the loan as large as possible, right? And it could be that you're even in a situation where, hey, you didn't actually need to have that loan, but the bank convinces you that, oh, well, why put all that money towards that house right
Well, you could
now
be using it for
when
other
I
stuff.
can,
Yeah.
yeah, you can use it for other expenses, right?
Yeah.
All you have to do is pay this interest on it, but it means that you don't have to fork the whole bill right now, right? We'll cover the rest of the costs and you pay us over a given period of time,
Don't
right?
you want to go
But
to Hawaii?
yeah, yeah, right. You want to take a trip with your family.
We
You
have
want to
the
have your
perfect
kids
credit
play
card for
hockey
that.
or whatever. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. That's the beginning of, not to jump into that world, but
Yeah. That's a
of
whole nother
the
can of worms.
credit card aspect
Yeah.
of you know its future use problem,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
Um, but yeah, if you make it so that people have to buy things on credit, right? And obviously a house is a nice, easy one because it's hard to convince people to buy a banana or whatever, like basic food on credit. But something like a car and
It's going to take
housing,
you a while to pay
those are
off.
easier to
Yeah.
convince because there is going to be a larger ticket price with them. But yeah, the more things you can buy on credit, the more that banks can make profit, right? Especially at a time when um, banks weren't heavily,
Regulated.
yeah, weren't well. They were regulated, but there have been times throughout our history, and we did talk about this in previous episodes, where banks were not allowed to do investing, right? The way that the banks made money was really on loans and that interest that they received from those loans. Whereas
Yeah, it was her lifeblood.
eventually you get into investment banking where banks are taking that money and putting it into the stock market and things like that. But again, I don't want to go down that road. In general, what you need to kind of focus on is that banks have an incentive for you to take out a loan, take out a mortgage, and um, have that dollar value, regardless of the interest rate, um, that dollar value be as high as possible, right? Um, and to your point about the regulation aspect, we've seen over the years, especially in recent years, but I would make the argument you can go back 40 years plus, and you can see that banks have not always been honest with how much money people can actually afford, right?
Yeah.
So if I have to buy a house that's let's say nowadays, right, $1 million. Well, there's very few of us that have anywhere close to $1 million
Just available.
to buy
Yeah.
that house, right? So we just accept, okay, you're gonna put it on a mortgage, and they'll pay it over
You put a
whatever. You have
certain
an
percentage
amortization
down.
period
Yeah.
of yeah. You put whatever 5 to 20% down on it, and you have an amortization period of, let's say, upwards of 30 years, and it's like, okay, I'm going to pay that off in the 30 years. Well, it's easy to say that. It's another thing to really look at it and crunch the numbers based off of, okay, I make X amount of dollars every year. Um, the interest rate might change. All of those different factors, but at the end of the day, the bank just wants you to if I can slap
take the loan. Yeah,
even a 2% interest on an entire loan, well, I'd rather that loan be for $800,000 rather than
correct.
$100,000,
Because
right?
it's a monumentous amount,
Yeah,
difference in
right.
dollars. Yeah,
Yeah, like in that, the amount of people that you need to have with a mortgage goes down a lot more when you already have huge mortgages in the first place, right?
yeah,
Um, so yeah, hopefully that kind of makes sense. The general aspect of banks have an incentive to want to, one, give you a mortgage, give you a loan, and then on top of that, they have no qualms about having that mortgage be as large as possible, right? Like I don't know, like Jordan, I know you rent, right?
yeah.
I don't know if have you ever gone to the bank to look at like what if you were looking at buying a house, like for what you'd be approved for?
Like 10 years ago, because ever since then, like I know now, like to get
Yeah,
qualified
that
for
you're
a
way
mortgage
off.
share,
Yeah,
it's like double the average income most people are making anyways.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, and especially in Canada in particular right now, the stress tests have, like, the regulation on that has gone up a lot. Like,
yeah,
so I know for like my mortgage stuff, the stress tests are actually, like, I think the interest rates at the time, because obviously they've gone up.
yeah,
But at the time that I was looking at when we were refinancing things around like 3-4% or something like that. And then the stress test, which is basically they say, can you pay? Would you still be able to pay if the interest rate went up to this amount? And it was
yeah.
going up to like 9%. So it was like just over double the
What
amount.
it's at, yeah,
Yeah, so it really does take a lot to be able to get that mortgage nowadays, but that's also after a lot of things have gone wrong with the housing market
over
in
the last
particular, right?
decade or so, yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Really, really, the eye opening since 2008, of course, but
yes.
with the United States, but even
We kind
kind
of
of,
we
yeah,
didn't
like over
prepare
that
ourselves for
longevity.
when it hit. Like
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Yeah,
yeah,
it just
we didn't listen.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, because now we're
Um,
doing. It kind of looks like, well, Toronto's the largest real estate bubble on the planet right now, and
yes,
it's
yeah,
looking a lot like Florida did in 2008.
yeah. Yeah, and I think Canada also, as a whole, is in a really rough place because Toronto is a big bubble and Vancouver is a
Yeah,
big bubble, and those are like the two
and
largest
now the interest rates
metropolitans,
are
really.
also turning like places like Montreal and stuff like
Yep.
not as bad as Toronto or Vancouver, but like they're starting to feel it in places like that now too,
Yeah. Yeah.
because that has a
Hundred
trickle
percent.
down effect on not
Yeah,
just
because if you can't
mortgage
afford
holders.
here,
Yeah,
then you're maybe moving somewhere
yeah,
else, and
and
then
it
like the
trickles down
domino
to not
effect.
just mortgage holders because people that rent from people that own now end up paying more as well. So it's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
it makes it harder for them to save up to get in when you make it harder, like when you raise the bar on like your down payment, your stress test, and all that stuff. So people who are renting, they're trying to save for a mortgage, can't because their rent is so high.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a vicious.
Yeah. And I love that you brought that up. I Because I don't want to mentally get too far ahead of myself, I want us to come back to that because we are going to kind of talk about a bit of the repercussions of the fact that if people can't afford to buy a house themselves, then they're going into the rental market, and then what does that really mean if you have all these people going to the rental market, so on and so forth. So definitely keep that in the back of your mind. We'll definitely like kind of
Yeah,
retouch upon it because I think it's a super important point. But yeah, the reason why I was asking about the if you had ever gone to like get a mortgage approval, they always tend to approve you. Maybe not as much nowadays. I would have to like double check that, but a lot of times they will approve you for way more than you ever
we
want to
should be.
spend.
Yeah, and then people
Yeah,
get stuck with
yeah.
mortgages that they can't afford to pay.
100%, right?
Yeah,
And because the hard part is you get approved for, let's say, more than you were ever expecting, but then because you were approved for that, you're like, well, I guess I could get that house that's $1 million, or
yeah,
I could get that house that's whatever,
yeah. Even
right?
like 600,000, it's like it's still yeah,
Meaning, yeah, even though you really meant to only spend Yeah, right. Like half of that,
or a third
or
of it.
like
Yeah.
three. Yeah, 2/3,
Yeah.
whatever. But you end up maxing out what you're approved for, thinking that, oh, the bank said I could afford this, right?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, what that actually means is, uh, is not always the most.
You're just going to be paying more over time, technically. Like,
Yeah, paying more over time, but also like you potentially are living beyond your means at that
yeah.
point, right?
Which we all know, like, it's based on the economic numbers and everything, that it's definitely a reality right
Yeah.
now, right? So,
Yeah. And you're again, we're gonna get into some of the other stuff with it, but obviously if you're in an environment that has a high demand, you kind of find yourself in a bit of a situation where if you're like, okay, I know that I'm approved for blank amount of dollars on a mortgage. If I max out that mortgage to be able to get the house because the like bidding wars that are going on, you're kind of almost mentally in your own self incentivized to just say, okay, well, you know what? The bank says I can afford it. Like I know the house seems way overpriced, but if I don't buy it now, like I'm never going to be able to get in on the market, right? And that kind of domino effect that goes from there.
yeah,
Right?
it just keeps cascading its way
Yeah,
through the
exactly.
economy. Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many, the repercussions. And again, we'll get to some of those things because I think that's almost in some ways an even more interesting conversation than why houses are so expensive. But nevertheless, you get the idea. Banks with their mortgages, when they loan you out money, they're obviously a huge incentive for them to loan as much money as possible because they're going to make that interest and that's what they make profit on, right?
Yeah.
Especially going back to some of our earlier banking episodes where you realize that banks don't actually have to have that money
There.
to
Yes,
loan it out
correct.
to you in the first place, right? So it's pretty easy for them to be like, sure, I'll loan you a $500,000 or whatever.
Yeah, first thing it's not their money. The second thing it's not usually their money.
It's not even actual money,
Yeah.
right? Like until because they just assume everyone's going to pay it back. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, right? That gives you a bit of that point, right? The next point that I want to touch upon is really the housing industry, right? And so in particular, the real estate industry, right? So there is obviously, whether you like to believe it or not, there is an incentive for real estate agents to one, you want buying and selling to happen as much as possible, right? So there is a bit of a give or take and a bit of a threshold that you don't want to break. But for the most part, as long as demand is there, they want houses to sell for ideally as much as possible, right? So for anyone who knows enough about kind of real estate agents and the real estate market, real estate agents make their money based off of a percentage that the house sells at, let's say, right? Yeah. So if I'm a real estate agent, Jordan, you have a house that you're trying to sell. So I come to you and I say, oh, I'll sell your house for you, right? I want you to get the most amount of money for that house. And that's an obvious one, right? Because as the seller, you of course want as much money as possible back in your pocket because you're selling your house. And I, as a real estate agent, want to get that for you.
Yeah.
But I would be lying to myself if I didn't also acknowledge the fact that I make a percentage of what you sell. Yeah. Right? Like, so I think it's normally around like 2%, right? So 2% on a $200,000 house versus 2% on a $2 million house is a significant difference, right?
A couple zeros there.
Yeah, 100%, right? So that's one side of it. And then, of course, there's also the buyer side of it. As a real estate agent, if, let's say, again, same scenario, I'm a real estate agent, you're someone looking to buy a house, I, of course, am going to try to get you the best deal as possible, which means we're going to spend, ideally, as least as possible, right? Because that's what's going to make you feel good, that you got a good
Deal.
deal
Yeah.
relative to everything. But I also, same as that selling real estate agent, make money based off of a percentage of the like final sale. And then on top of that, as much as I might be honest with you when something's way overpriced, right?
Okay.
But I also, at the same time, if you have an area that has a high demand, which for you and I living where we do, we live in high demand areas. I think obviously for most listeners, they probably
Yeah,
are
you fudge
in
it a
high
little
demand
bit.
areas. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because that can look very different. Like you don't have to be in a big city for it to be a high demand area,
Area.
right?
Yeah.
It just has to be a supply and demand conversation, right? So if we're going to go buy a house and there's a bit of a bidding war, let's say, meaning that there are multiple buyers
Trying
that are
to,
interested in
get
it,
the down payment in. Yeah.
I'm I am likely, even though this is a fair strategy, I guess if you want to call it that, I'm going to encourage you to put more money over the asking price, um, in hopes that you get that house, right?
Yeah.
And I might encourage you, if you're like, oh, I really like this house, I might say, hey, go even more than you were even thinking, right? Like the difference between, oh, I put $5,000 over the asking price versus, oh, I'm going to put
50.
$50,000
Yeah.
over the asking price, right? Um, and that's a pretty commonplace, right? If you know, if you're listening to this, or even you, Jordan, I'm sure you know from people that have kind of like gone into buying a
The
house or
market.
selling a house.
Yeah.
Yeah, or you hear all the time, even like, oh, sold over asking, like
Oh,
$100,000 over
yeah. Well,
asking,
do you
and
remember like that was happening for a long time, right?
100%, right? Um, but yeah, right? Like, so there's lots of incentives, even across the board, even in the strategies, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, we'll list the price at a lower amount in hopes that you get lots of other people that are interested in it, and then there becomes a bidding war, or um, where you get people. A lot of times, real estate agents will come to your house. Um, let's say, like, well, because you don't own your place, you rent, but let's say it's for your parents, right? A real estate would come to them, agent
For
that would come to
appraisal.
them, and then they would appraise the
Yeah.
house at what it is, and then they would say, well, maybe you should actually renovate all these things,
Yeah.
right? And then you'll get more money for it. Well, yeah, it's true, you will. And if you've ever watched kind of those like home decorating shows that do buying and selling and all that stuff, you
Half of
will
the stuff on
see that.
TLC. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like HGTV, or
Thank you.
yeah,
That's it. Yeah.
TLC or whatever one.
That's the
Yeah,
one. Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. You'll see where, let's say, okay, we're gonna put $100,000 into renovating this house, like updating the kitchen, all this stuff, and maybe they're going to make, on that $100,000 investment on repairs or renovations, they make an extra $50,000, right? Because it's made it nicer, and that's great, right? Like at the end of the day, you can now list that house for $150,000 more than if you hadn't put any of that money into it, right? So there is obviously a financial benefit for you, but the reality is that you had to put that money into it, and that extra $50,000 worth of profit plus that extra $100,000 of your investment
Yeah.
is also going to go back to that end little total when
Correct.
I make,
For your
as a real estate
2%.
agent,
Yeah.
2%
Exactly.
on the buying and selling of things, or whatever, 1.5%. I don't know what it is nowadays.
Yeah.
I think it's something like that, 1.5 or 2%. I think a lot of real estate agents make.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, so it is it again, I never want to, like, I know a lot of real estate agents, they're really good people, like this is not a question of someone being nefarious with it, but you wouldn't be doing your job in a, not to put it like this, but in a capitalist system where you're trying to make money at the end of the day. It would be naive to think that all real estate agents are not trying to look at that bottom dollar at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right? Maybe it's not the number one motivating factor for every real estate agent, but it's definitely a factor that plays into things, right? No matter who you are, even the best of intentioned real estate agents, right?
Yeah.
So as a market as a whole, whether it's real estate agents, of course, there's other people that are involved with like selling houses. So if houses are really expensive, let's say, and then you are someone who, what's it called? Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on words right now. You know, the people that come into your house that like put like staging, like
Oh yeah. Oh god.
like
Yeah.
put in furniture and all that
just
stuff
like,
to make it look
do
nice.
The pictures
Like
and everything. Yeah. Before
yeah,
you're gonna
yeah.
sell
This
it, yeah.
the people who do staging. I don't know
like
what
interior
I forget
designers?
what. Yeah, something like that. But yeah, so anyone who does that role, you of course, and don't get me wrong, you have to justify it based off of things, but when you are selling a house that is very expensive, yes, there has to be some nicer things that you're putting into that house, but you're also able to justify a higher
Asking price. Yeah.
yeah, asking price for your service,
Yeah.
right? Because you're now saying, oh, well, I deal with high end clients, or even if it's not high end clients, maybe it's normal like clients, but it's this idea of what's the percentage of how much money, if I stage the house and I'm able to give you an extra $50,000 because I made the house look nice, well, that's going to kind of justify how much you can then charge, right?
Yeah.
Versus if you have a house that costs only $100,000, well, odds are no matter what you do for staging, like it's not going to just magically make that house like double the price. It's not going to be, right? Like maybe you're only increasing the value of that house by $10,000. Well, now you maybe can only justify a $2,000 charge for your services versus the house that's the exact same house in a different city,
yeah.
with the exact same things that you're putting in that house, right? But because the house costs 5 times, 6 times, 10 times as much, you're able to justify a larger cut out of that, so to speak.
Sale,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely incentives as a whole through that industry, right? Similar to the banking thing, again.
Correct. Everyone has their reasons.
Yeah, right? It doesn't always have to be that you're, oh, let me squeeze every dime out of you. But the reality is that is an undertone within a market like this that, like everything else, is connected with that kind of capitalist mindset of you should be trying to make as much money, right? Like you wouldn't be a really good real estate agent if you weren't trying to be successful.
Yeah.
Right. Like if that was the case, then every real estate agent would just, I'll sell your house for free, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like no, the idea is that you want to make as much money so you can grow your business, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of that. I guess the point number 2. The next point that this is a bit of like a shorter point, mainly because I think it's obvious, but it's the cost of doing business. So things like labor and materials,
yeah.
right?
We all know there was like a wood shortage.
Yeah.
A few years back.
So yeah, especially during like the pandemic, we had some lumber shortages. I think we've had lumber shortages kind of
on and off,
sporadically
yeah,
throughout.
because there's embargoes and all that stuff that happened too that affect it.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah, even like kind of on that note, whenever there's been some trade wars with like tariffs on like steel and stuff like that, like or lumber, like if you have extra, maybe it's not that the supply isn't there, but the cost to get that might be greater because hey, I'm paying an extra tax on it, right? In the case of tariffs. So materials are definitely going to be always a big one. Labor, of course, right? Maybe like actually with my house, not that it necessarily affected the price because we had already paid for it, but in the process of building the house, a set of trades went on strike, right? It was like masonry and I don't know. There was
never know
a
when that's
handful
going to happen.
Yeah,
exactly.
right. So that's going to like change how expensive things are, or even just the lack of people who have gone into those industries,
Yeah,
right?
not enough of them, right? So
Yeah, like you and I are definitely, I think it would be fair to say, like when I went to school, we were somewhat discouraged from going the college route of like learning a trade, right? And stuff like that. It
correct.
was like,
They
go to
push you in a
university. That's how
certain
you,
direction. Yeah.
yeah, right? That's how you actually make something of yourself. Meanwhile, everyone has just like a useless university degree
Yeah, and a dead end
and not
job.
working in their
Yeah,
field.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, but right, like so you can have a situation where there's a shortage of whatever kind of a plumber or something like that.
Electricians, yeah.
Yeah, electricians, exactly, right? Um, so the skilled labor in particular, right? If there's shortages of it or just high demand,
It's just going to
that
affect it from like
cost,
the smallest building material right up to the actual
yeah,
finished product,
right.
right? So yeah,
And I should note that obviously, in the case of the cost of doing business that we're talking about with labor and materials and stuff like that, that's really looking at new homes, right? So
yeah,
if you have a high demand area and you're trying to build new homes to kind of reduce that cost overall, like over the entire market, because you're increasing supply,
why? Yeah,
um, there is going to be, yeah, some difficulties with making sure that the cost of building those houses is not going to be astronomical,
no,
right?
cool, yeah,
And then on top of that, um, inevitably, once that house is kind of actually like a part of the market, then there's that bit of a balancing act of, okay, well, if it cost me this much to buy the house when it was brand new,
yeah,
now when I go to sell it, right, or just even if you're not selling it, just like what it's appraised in the market at, um, you have this aspect of, okay, well, the hope ideally is that it's going to be worth more than what you bought it for,
later down the road,
right?
yeah,
In any given period of time. Yeah.
yeah,
We know that that's not always the case, depending on if you bought a house in 2007 and then in 2008 in the United States, the like market crashed.
yeah.
Well, like, yeah, your house might not be worth anywhere close to what it is. But as a whole, the goal is that, the properties that you buy are going to be worth more. And so
Over time,
if
yeah.
the initial cost is great,
You would
because
expect to
labor and
get
materials are,
more out of it later on, yeah,
yeah, right, it's going to mean that much more that you're now trying to account for,
yeah,
right? Because the overall cost of those things. So it's not easy to then bring down housing prices just by building more houses if the building of those houses is very expensive, right? Because the first two in particular, I mean, don't get me wrong, obviously banks play a big role in building houses as well.
yeah.
Like if you're a developer, you're going to the bank for a loan, all that kind of stuff. There's obviously sometimes real estate agents involved with new builds, but typically it's just straight from a developer. But
Yeah.
as a whole, all of those extra costs, right? If a developer can't build the house cheaper than what the houses are already going for on the market,
You're not making a difference.
then
yeah.
you're not, yeah, supply is not going to change
That's
it
why
because they're
that's-
going to be like, I have to sell it at a certain price, or otherwise the incentive for that developer to build that house is not going to be there, right?
Yeah.
If it costs $1 million for I don't know, a
Single family
2200, yeah, right, like a 2000 square foot home, let's just say, right, depending on where you live.
Yeah.
If that's what it costs just in the market, and then for me to go build that same house in the same place is also going to cost me that, then I didn't reduce anything for the like
Overall,
impact
yeah.
of, yeah, I increased supply, but demand basically like is going to have to stay stagnant.
Yeah.
Or like, or if not increase, because it's just like another house that you're going to buy at that same price, right? Like it doesn't, that reduction within supply and demand from one or the other is not going to necessarily happen,
Impact. Yeah.
right? Because those costs are still going to be there. So it does depend, like we said in kind of the beginning of the episode. Each one of these factors may play more of a role depending on where you live, right?
Yes.
Banking, like the loans might be more of an issue than the cost of business, but and then you could have just as easily the reverse. That's like the banks could care less, but like the ability to get
Opposite end
the
of the hand,
materials here, yeah, because it's more remote, is just super expensive. So we can't do anything about it.
Yeah, because it's going to cost you $10 or sorry, $200 to like ship a piece of plywood or something like that. So
Sure, right? Yeah. Yeah.
And then it just outweighs the cost of I saved money here, but then you're losing it there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that hopefully that point is straightforward enough.
Yeah, it's your typical supply and demand issues. Like you'll have that affect all kinds of other stuff. Whether it's just because it's such a large part of the economy, it's more noticeable.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, a house is a product, right?
Yeah.
And so making that product, right? That is also like I guess somewhat of an interesting aspect of housing in particular. And you can make the argument that cars fall into this to a certain degree as well. But the vast majority of houses that are bought and sold are not new houses.
Yes.
Right? Right? Like, so it's the like resale market that makes up the vast majority of
it.
Yeah. And that does add a different element relative to other commercial goods, right? That you're basically buying something and that probably was owned by someone else previously. And ideally they are making some kind of profit off of that, and it is technically unrelated to the initial like price of it, right? Like it's almost like when the popularity of a new video game system comes out and everyone buys them all up, and then it's like the resale market or tickets to a concert, right?
Yeah, we see
like
that.
Ticketmaster sells it for X amount, but then if you want to go buy it, it's like double the price. And you're like, but that's the same seat and the same concert and the same right, like nothing's changed, but it's just like, oh well, the demand's there, right? And I bought them all up, right? These houses are already owned, or these tickets are already owned, right? So yeah, it is an interesting factor when it comes to housing in particular.
Yeah.
Our last point, kind of, and I mean, I'm sure there could be some others, but these four cover the fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the last point is actually it's something that I think we don't always think of, but maybe in election years we do think about it. It's government's impact on housing, right? So there's a lot of conversations, especially for us in Canada, about housing, that like whether it's a mayor or the premiers or even the federal government, right? What's the prime minister doing about housing, right? Because all stages of government, levels of government. Thank you. Yeah, that's a better word. All levels of government do have a role when it comes to housing, but they all kind of have different roles, so to speak.
The city's just there to tax you.
Yeah. So yeah, I was going to say, let's get into it, right? So one of the things that play into the costs of houses is going to be property taxes, right? So that's really at a municipal level. We've talked about that in our tax episode.
Well, what was it? Like, for example, like where my parents live, because it's like it's supposed to be a quiet end of the city, right?
Okay, yeah.
Like theirs went up 2022 to 2023 went up like 7 or 8%.
Yeah.
And that was like, I don't think they told the city that they built a bathroom in the basement.
Yeah, that's always that's something.
Like, well, we're living here. Screw you. We don't tell you.
Yeah. That's one of those things that bothers me so much about property taxes, that if you like
do anything,
you buy a house, you make things improvements on that house. Yeah, for you put that money in, like it's your investment, all that kind of stuff. And then now the government says, oh, well, you finished your basement. Well, now actually your property's worth more, and therefore we deserve more taxes from you, right? Like, like things like that.
Yeah.
Like, I hate property taxes, and I obviously, we talked about this in the tax episode. I get that it's probably one of the larger driving forces in tax revenue for municipalities, but the way that you do it, it's just like, the
Yeah,
worst, right?
because you times 8,000 times just even 10,000 households,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Oh
like
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's not a
It
lot in a
adds up.
municipality.
Yeah. Right. Like, yeah. Um, but yeah, it's also like, so property taxes. You can make an argument that it's not necessarily what you see in terms of the sticker price for when a house is being bought or sold, right? Um, but it's kind of the cost of owning that house that plays into why property taxes are important for understanding why houses are so expensive.
Yeah.
Um, it's like if you have, well, actually, I think we might have even talked about this the first time we recorded this episode. Um, Sometimes when people win houses in like a lottery or something like that, they end up selling the house either back to the lottery or just in general because they can't afford
The
the like
payments.
property
Yeah,
taxes that are associated with it. Because
happens.
again, if I win a mansion, right? Even if I didn't pay a single dime on that mansion, right? That I don't have, like, let's say that you don't have to actually pay the kind of consumer taxes associated with it. It's just the property taxes. Depending on what you do for a living,
That
those
could still
property
be insane.
taxes
Yeah,
are going to be, yeah,
yeah.
right. Like you could be paying $10,000 a month in
Oh yeah,
property
you own like a
taxes, and
million,
you're like, what?
million
I
dollar
I
like
only make 2,000. Like, oh
cottage in
no, not 2,000,
Muskoka.
but you know what I mean,
Yeah,
right?
but if you
Yeah,
own like $1 million, like what is it? Those Princess Margaret ones.
yeah. Those like,
Like yeah,
yeah,
you
whatever, the
can end
$5 million
you could be
home,
like
like
someone
cottage.
making like 50K a year, end up buying a
Yeah,
$3 million
when
cottage. And
yeah,
it's like,
that
well, I'm
has
gonna be stuck with the transfer payment on it and the
yeah,
property payment. It's like, how is that even doable?
yeah, right.
Yeah, you're better off selling the place and
Yeah,
just
and
pocketing the
that's
money.
often what
Yeah,
happens, right? Yeah. Um. So yeah, right. Like it's a bit of a hidden cost in some ways because it's not automatically that you look at that when you're like, oh, this house is on sale, or not on sale, but is on the market for X amount of dollars. But yeah, the property taxes, uh, definitely are going to be a huge thing that affect it, and of course that's government.
government.
And it's also sometimes different reasons for why property taxes are what they are, right? So obviously we talked about, like, yeah, if you improve your house, your property taxes can go up, meaning that your taxes might be greater than the person that's literally next door because you renovated
Yeah, you
something
put
in
in
your
a
house.
toilet. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly, right? They did the bathroom. Um, then you also have situations where, so again, I think we might have talked about this the last time with when we recorded this episode the first time, where your parents live, because it is considered more of a higher end,
it's like a quiet
there's a little
suburban.
bit more luxury oriented municipality, right? It There is a bit of a demand that the municipality makes on its citizens that says, as a whole, regardless of where, regardless of the type of house that you live in, right? It's not like everyone in Oakville lives in a mansion,
Yeah,
but if you want to live in Oakville, you have to pay a little bit more just to be a part of this society. You know what I mean? Right? Like, so that it's like, oh, we're gonna put money into improving the harbor and like all of these, like, I don't know, whatever you want to look at for a place like that.
yeah.
That, yeah, they justify it and say, hey, this is a sought after place to live, and therefore we're going to make sure that the baseline of property taxes is higher than, say, somewhere else that's like even a municipality or two
Next thing, it
away
could
from
be
it.
adjacent,
Yeah,
even. Yeah,
exactly, right. And then you can also have the flip side of that, where it'd be something like where I live, because of the fact that there's a lot of social welfare that is connected. Like, so I obviously I live in Oshawa. Not all of Oshawa, like if you looked at where I live, it's not very rough or anything like that. But Oshawa as a whole does require a lot of support. Like there's a lot of homeless people, there's a lot of
Yeah.
low income people, like so there's a lot of social welfare that goes into that, and of course there's a huge cost that comes with that. And so the municipality says, okay, regardless, again, you could be very poor in Oshawa, but your property taxes are all going up
Yeah.
because of those reasons, because everyone's going to have to pay a bit of a larger share, so to
Sure.
speak,
Yeah.
to support those expenses. So in the one scenario, it's about kind of maybe like improving on a superficial level of the municipality, and then there's the flip side
So
where it's like my side where it's like we're trying to stay afloat, so
we need. Yeah. We're still gonna
we're
take more. Yeah.
yeah, we have a lot of different expenses that are coming in. So yeah, property taxes are definitely going to uh make things as a whole more expensive,
Yeah.
right?
Major
Because
factor. Yeah.
yeah, I would love to know the statistics on how often municipalities lower property taxes. You know what I mean? Like, I
Probably
feel
because
like
there
it's one of
isn't
those
any.
things that's like, yeah, maybe they don't raise property taxes, but I don't know about the lowering aspect, right?
Chance they don't. But it has.
What was
I
that?
was like, I'm wondering, like, if anyone ever has.
Yeah, probably, right? Like,
Right?
I would assume probably not.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, they're used to it, right? uh, um, but yeah, uh, so the next kind of point, right? Because I think we've covered enough of property taxes,
Yeah.
and arguably, I think this is going to be one of the biggest factors, or I should say, the biggest impact that government has when it comes to influencing the housing market, and that's zoning.
Yeah.
So for anyone who doesn't know what that means, that's when a government, if you haven't played played any like city builder games, or if you didn't know
That's when
anything
it
about
puts land aside. Yeah.
yeah, well, so specifically with zoning, that's when like so a municipality looks at all the land that they have in their given area, right, in the city or town or whatever it is, and says you are allowed to build these types of industries in this area. So the kind of three like major one is like industrial, commercial, and residential,
Residential.
right?
Yeah.
Those are the things that they zone
And
for.
what they designate as
Obviously,
each. Yeah.
yeah, obviously the other aspect of that is the level of density of those three things. So like the you could have a high density commercial area,
Yeah.
meaning that you have like a I don't know, like again it's like shopping malls or like large like multi-floored buildings that have commercial in it versus just mom and pop shop
Yeah.
typically,
Yeah. Your
right?
big box
And
store versus your one
yeah,
off. Yeah.
an easier way to I think arguably an easier way to look at it is probably more when it comes to residential, right? The difference between a single family home versus increasing that density, whether that be something like a townhouse, whether that be apartment buildings,
Yeah.
right, so on and so forth, where you're basically saying more people are able to live in a given area,
As one way
and
versus the other. Yeah.
yeah, because the density is increased. So governments decide where you can zone. So in Ontario, for instance, a lot of conversations around the green belt, right? That's a provincially protected area of land that is essentially it's supposed to stay green, right? They're not supposed to develop on it. It's supposed to just stay natural. But the government has been trying to open that up where municipalities that are connected with the green belt can now say, okay, we're going to develop that land,
Yeah.
right? In conjunction, obviously, with the province, but that the aspect of, in particular, for our conversation, because we're talking about housing, we're really talking about the residential zoning.
Yeah.
There has been a huge push. Maybe probably I guess you could argue since the like 50s, but like it kind of stretches all the way, where municipalities wanted people to live that suburban dream, meaning that they want single family homes with
These
a
big space, they're
backyard.
changing that now to more like condo style almost.
Yeah, they're starting to,
Yeah.
but we're now, unfortunately, enough time has kind of gone by that if you look at most places where you live, not everywhere, so like for you, obviously living like Mississauga area, Mississauga has like a fair amount of high density. But all things considered, if you look across the GTA, high density housing is not
Common.
the norm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the norm. It exists everywhere in every municipality, but most of it is going to be low density where it's just, yeah, a single family home. Maybe at most you're talking about like like semi detached or right like
Something
stuff
like
like
that.
that
Yeah.
where it's still somewhat spaced out, but yet you still put people somewhat close together. But we're not going as far as saying, oh, there's apartment buildings everywhere and all that kind of stuff. So the issue with that, as you can probably imagine, is that if you have whatever, how many hectares of land or acres of land, if you are able to fit only a fraction of the amount of people because the houses are single family homes
Yeah.
versus if I made them all apartment buildings where each apartment building may cover the same amount of land as, I don't know,
3 or 4.
yeah, whatever, even let's say like six houses,
Yeah.
right? But the difference is instead of six families living there,
You
I
got like
have
100.
like 100.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's a huge difference from in terms of the supply and demand aspect of how many houses are on the market and where people can live.
Yeah.
So zoning in particular is probably up there with one of the most influential or maybe damning, depending on
How you
what
look at it.
perspective you want to take. Yeah, aspect of why it is so difficult to buy a house, because if there's all these people trying to buy a house and there's only so much supply, well, that's all because of zoning at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right? If we don't allow, because it's not simply, we don't live in a world anymore where it's like, okay, I find some land, I'm going to just decide to build a house on it, right? It's very structured that the government controls all of that. Right, like we talked, you had mentioned like land transfer taxes and all that stuff. The reason why you have all those things is because you're getting permits and deeds from the government to say that, oh, can I actually own this land, right? Like all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you're at the mercy of the government to open up land for zoning, and then on top of that, the type of zoning that they're going to allow for, right? Because if they want a certain image, like, because obviously, I mean, I think everyone would agree that it's nicer to look at single family homes than it is to look at big apartment buildings, right? If you want a certain image, well, that's going to be detrimental for the people who
Need a
maybe
different
can't.
type.
Yeah, because ultimately, like, this is the unfortunate truth about, I guess, maybe in particular with like capitalist societies, right? Is that some people will never be able to afford certain styles of houses, right? And you can make that all the way up to like most of us will not be able to afford a mansion type of thing, right? Like, but there's also a lot of people where you can make a good argument that there's a chunk of the population that will never be able to afford the equivalent of a single family home,
Yeah.
right? Based off of what they do for work.
Well, yeah, the nature
right?
of demographics is changing, right? Like, not a lot of
Yeah.
people are having families anymore, so it's mostly just like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So, yeah. And it's
Yeah.
just, the government really hasn't caught up with that yet.
Yeah. And recognizing, yeah, the different strains that are going to
Yeah,
happen.
you need to have more than just, if you're going to zone for residential, you need to have a variety of options available depending on where it is.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
Like, it's not going to make sense to put a bunch of single, like your typical
Yeah.
suburban style, like picket fences
Yeah.
in places like Brampton or stuff where it's like, A, there's already
Yeah.
no space. Right, and B, it's not like it's like a high GDP area or whatever you want to call it, right? So it's
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's such a good point, right? Like, so um, it's the combination of the fact that populations are increasing, right? So it used to be back in the day, you could have a pretty basic job, and I mean that in just
Oh yeah.
don't take it. People don't take offense to that, but you know what I mean, like a normal, nothing crazy type of job, and be able to have one person working,
Yeah.
like and you'd be able to
Everything was
afford a
affordable.
three
Yeah.
bedroom home or 4 bedroom home, and it would be a single detached home,
Yeah.
right? But with populations increasing, and then on top of that, people not or governments not recognizing the jobs that are available in their municipality, right? Like obviously in a place like Oshawa, we're big on manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of like car manufacturing plants are in Oshawa, right? So if that is a good chunk of your population, and you know that those people make X amount of dollars, right? You have to keep that in mind when you're looking at what type of housing you need to have available for those people, right? Because at the end of the day, you can't have them make up money just as much as you can't have the like supply of houses be just like made up out of nowhere, right?
Yeah. This goes back to what we were saying about materials and everything too, right? So
Yeah, exactly, right? And I think kind of going off like this is a bit of like a second point with this, but or third point, I don't know where we're at now.
yeah, third, yeah.
But another point with the government stuff is you hear all the time about government housing, right? And so that's specifically like co-ops, like houses that are built by the government that have fixed pricing. Typically, I would make the argument it's probably rental pricing.
Usually, yeah.
Maybe in some cases you can buy it. I
guess maybe after so many years or whatever.
Yeah. Again, I haven't personally had to utilize those things, but government housing is specifically that they save certain houses that they've built for a certain portion of the population. So if you're on maybe some kind of like welfare, for instance,
any kind of social assistance that requires like some
yeah,
supplement to your
right?
income,
Yeah. So you could be working, but maybe you make very, very little for whatever reason,
you're
right?
Like
it doesn't
injured and your company's not paying out,
exactly.
So you don't have an income now. Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah. So many reasons. It's not just insert whatever possible reason you can think of. But so there's a few things with government housing. One, most municipalities and most neighborhoods and communities don't want government housing because they find it an eyesore, which obviously then causes a lot of problems. That if that wins out, that means that okay, there's more and more people that could have used that government housing that are now having to go onto the open market, so to speak. Right? We talked about, like, again, bringing it back to what you had mentioned earlier about rental and how that industry gets affected with the housing market, right? So there's more and more people competing in that world. And then the other aspect of it is that like government housing is obviously useful, but it's also somewhat a band-aid solution, right? Because you basically are saying that I'm going to build, no offense, like a not very nice house to be able to allow some of these people who are so priced out of the market to be able to have some place to live, that you're not just having all of these homeless people, right? But it's almost like a facade, so to speak, right? Like, because you're controlling it because the government is controlling that part, the cost of it, right? You as someone, for instance, like you're not poor enough to go on government housing, but at the same time it's kind of like
without a break, you're never going to be able to save for a mortgage, kind of thing.
Right? Like, so it's like, oh, because you make like more than like it's the like, poverty line, but it's like then you have to fend for yourself,
need to
right?
Find where that is.
Right, right, like exactly.
Because so 10 years ago, I'd have been doing great where I'm at now, but now it's like,
maybe, but
paycheck
now
to
it's
paycheck,
that much further, right? yeah, so it's all of those things where it's like, yeah, it feels like a double-edged sword. It feels like there's not a lot of incentive to want to have that kind of government housing.
Mm-hmm.
um, and yeah, there's a lot of kind of implications, I guess, that kind of go with
For that, yeah.
government housing in particular. um, the last kind of 2 points, I guess, related to government, um, are interest rates, which we've kind of
With
we
inflation,
talked about that,
yes,
right?
yes, we had
Yeah,
the
right.
whole
Like
inflation
with
episode.
all the different
Yeah,
inflation and banking, all that stuff. So obviously the central banks, or
yeah. Not to
depending on where
mention
you
that's
live.
been in the news nonstop for like the last 2 years. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you've been living under a rock, I think pretty much most of the world has had those same conversations. So, nevertheless, right? Yeah. Central banks, or the government sets the kind of prime interest rate, aka the interest rate that banks are allowed to
Levy, I guess. Yeah.
borrow money from, kind of thing. Like when they borrow money from the central bank, what rate are they able to get it at, and then depending on whatever that is. So in our case, I don't know, whatever, it's like 5 something%
Yeah.
now. Or it might be like 5% flat. Then the banks that you get your mortgage from is then going to make kind of like a interest rate profit on top of that. Right. So they kind of, if the prime interest rate is 5%, maybe they're charging you 6% for your mortgage. Right. And that's where they're going to kind of make a little bit of extra money, especially if they have to borrow from the central bank as a whole. So interest rates, that's going to play a big factor of it. Not only just from that initial, hey, you want to go get a mortgage, like and buy this house for X amount of dollars, right? Because sometimes feel like it's easy to forget that. I'm going to use a Canadian context because that's what I'm going to be more familiar with. But if you go back, whatever, I don't know, maybe like 30, 40, whatever, X amount of years, you were looking at like it wasn't uncommon to have here's a 16% interest rate, right? Like, whereas like we like die right now when we're like, oh god, 6%. How am I supposed to ever function with that, right? But the difference is that the like costs of the actual like house are going to be way different,
Correct.
right?
Incomes, everything, right? So.
Yeah, incomes are way different. You were looking at a house that was, you might had a let's say upwards of a 19-20% interest rate, but maybe the house only cost $50,000.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
yeah. So it's there's going to be huge costs that are associated with interest rates, but then also in terms of the long term aspect of it, when interest rates are high, it means, like, kind of going back to, well, several aspects, but like the cost of doing business or whatever, banks and mortgages, that you're then going to want to get a return on that investment in some capacity, right? Like, you don't want to sell that house for less than you paid for it, obviously, but then you have to take into account that you also paid all of this extra amount in interest over the years. And that also has to somehow get recouped because it's money that is going into society. At the end of the day, not at the point of that mortgage being created, but over time when you pay the bank the principal plus interest, you are kind of indirectly then creating the money that wasn't existing prior to that.
Place,
yeah, because of the fact that like there was money that was loaned out to you that didn't exist, so it pretends as if you had that money, and then you are then paying interest, which is like the money that also didn't exist in the first place that you had to like earn and now pay back. So that inflationary aspect that comes into play means that, yeah, a house that's whatever, you buy a house and then 30 years later you go to sell it because you're retiring type of situation and want to move into a downsize or go into a retirement home, the kind of costs that are associated with that inevitably get lumped in with that house, and therefore that's why you see situations where someone can buy a house and then for I don't know, like we said, the $50,000,
Yeah.
and then 30 years later, that house is 1.5 million.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and you're like, what? How does that work? Right? But it's because there's so many other factors on top of the fact of just general inflation that happens. But there's like a cost of doing business, so to speak, that comes into play, and interest rates are a part of that cost.
Yeah.
And then finally, not that it's, again, not in any order of importance, but permits are always going to play into it. So that's really kind of going back to the cost of doing business. But if a developer is building a house, right?
Depends or so.
Or,
Yeah.
sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, no. Like you say, like where he puts the house, like sometimes, I don't know, they might need to rezone it because blah, 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 like, and whatever. Like,
Yeah, not even just zoning, but even just the like aspect of, if you want to put this type of house on this spot, you're going to have to pay
extra
X amount for, right? Like, even you hear it all the time more with renovations, right? So you have to get permits for, like, I'm renovating my kitchen.
Yeah, because there's a
right?
gas line or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in some cases, it's a very minor cost because it's more of just an approval. But then there are other times where it can be a larger cost, where let's say you're doing an addition onto your house, right?
Yeah.
Like making your house bigger. Well, it's not just the cost of making your house bigger, like the materials and the labor, but it's also the permits that you need then from the government giving you approval to say,
yeah.
okay, yeah, now you can take that what you want to do with your house. We're giving you permission, but it's because you paid us whatever X amount of dollars to be able to do that, right?
Exactly.
That's why you hear like crazy things when people don't get permits, right? Because there's always a cost to it, right? So the reason why sometimes people like renovators or builders may choose not to get a permit, which is illegal, obviously, is because they're trying to save some money. And then you hear, like, again, going back to those like HGTV shows and stuff like that, and they're like, actually, we found out that this was not, like, this addition was not permitted.
Yeah.
So the city is now actually asking us to tear it down, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you're like, what? But yeah, it's because the government's going to force you to have permission, and then depending on whether you want to pay for that permission or not, you might make some decisions. But ultimately, if you are following the law, there's going to be an additional cost. It's like a tax almost.
Yeah.
That gets put on housing in particular.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are kind of overarching, like, obviously the four main ones with, like, banking and the industry and cost of doing business and governments. To what you just said there's some of the major driving forces for why houses become so expensive, or just arguably why houses cost what they cost. Right?
Yeah.
Because obviously these industries could change certain aspects of what they do to make
any
things
one
less.
of those four factors can tweak it in some way.
But as a whole, they typically increase costs of things, right?
Keep paying.
I was wondering, do you want to maybe chat a little bit about you might not need to say any more than what you said already, but obviously the impact of, if you're priced out of the market, it means that you are then because housing obviously is a necessity, right? So if you can't afford to buy a house, then you're choosing to rent, right? And for some people, maybe that makes sense because you're super wealthy and you're traveling the world all the time, and renting makes sense because you're not staying in one place, right? But for the average person who rents, they are renting because that's the place that they need to live.
Well, most
to
people,
be able to have a place to sleep before they go
out,
to work.
You rent, and then you eventually buy a place. Like, that's how it usually worked, right? So
yeah. Or, well, I mean, you go back enough that it wouldn't even be that. You might even skip the rental part. You might have just gone straight to, like, we got married and bought a house, like, type of thing. Like, I lived with my parents until then.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think as a whole, it would have been, relatively normal that you kind of, graduate from some post-secondary education, you find yourself in a job, You're not living at home anymore because your job might not be right close by, so you're renting, and then you're able to save enough money each month to be able to eventually put a down payment on a house. Or maybe that's also giving you enough time to find a significant other as well, and together you have enough money
Yeah.
to
Now afford
put down
it.
on a
Yeah.
house, right? Yeah, right. And that is like a pretty. I think most people would say like that's a pretty reasonable
Yeah.
way to go about things. But the reality is yeah, that very much so is not the case. Like you have the extremes where people can't even afford the rent, and then you have even just the norm of people rent and know that, like you said, like you're either paycheck to paycheck or just even if you're able to save something, it's very difficult to save the amount
Yeah.
needed because
get
houses
you
are so
into
expensive,
it, yeah.
right? Yeah, because you're not looking at, oh, do I need to save $20,000? You're looking at, I need to save whatever, $100,000 or something.
Something in the magnitude of more, like several times more than what you earn in a year.
Yeah,
Right. So
right.
that's difficult.
Which is used to be that it was like
Okay, well,
the
2 or
house
3
cost
years, now
maybe
it's
like
10 or 15.
yeah, yeah, right. Like it's like, oh, I make $40,000, so I buy a $250,000 house type of thing, which is obviously multiple times more than what you make in a year. But it made sense when you stretch it over a 30 year. Now you're talking about like a house that's you make, I don't know, $70,000 a year.
Yeah.
And then the only houses that you can look at are
$500,000 or up.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, if not more, easily.
Yeah,
right?
easily. Usually,
Yeah,
starting from
yeah,
7, core 3/4.
yeah.
Right. So yeah,
Especially if we're talking about housing, right?
Yeah.
You can find some things that are like a 1-bedroom apartment for like whatever $400,000.
those are the exceptions, not the rule. So
yeah. But even then, you're also saying to yourself, like, sure, it's great. You're now not giving your money away to a landlord. You're at least putting it towards your own asset. But it is a crazy thing to just be like, okay, I finally can afford a place. It's nothing special, but at least it's like a place that's my own. But it still costs you a pretty penny just to be able to get into that, and that doesn't really allow for a lot more room than just yourself, really. Right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, when people get pushed more and more into the rental market, it means that people who are renting then have to pay even more money.
Correct. So that's what you were saying earlier, right? So
yeah, right. Maybe you're lucky, like in your situation, right? You guys have been lucky because you've been in the place long enough that the rent has been
kind of locked in,
indirectly controlled because of that.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a rent controlled building. It's just that the government says you can only increase by a certain amount each year
after a certain time.
Yeah. And so, yeah, maybe you're lucky like that, but for the most part, if you moved at all or something like that, or you're new to a place that you're renting, you're going to be paying what the market is.
Exactly.
And then there's twofold with that, right? There's a huge high demand now because the cost of houses are so expensive. So you're kind of competing with the fact that, well, if the demand is there, then me as a landlord, I can charge more money for it, right? And then two, because the houses are more expensive, let's say I've recently become a landlord, right? And you bought a house. Well, the rent that you're going to need to cover your expenses are also going to be reflective of the fact that, hey, my mortgage payments or whatever are a lot more higher than what they would have been 10 years ago for this exact same property. So regardless of even the demand of things, I'm going to have to charge you more because of the fact that I need to at least break even, if not make like a little bit of money, so I have a bit of a nest egg to in case there's any issues with the place, right? Like, so there is so many
factors.
Because like the rental market in particular, it pushes a lot of people. When the housing market's crazy, it pushes people into the rental market. And then you've mentioned quite a few times that it's so bad in the rental market that the idea of being able to save while in the rental market is it's next to impossible, right? Like most people that I know who uh like who have been able to buy a place either were very lucky in their jobs early on in life that they had a very high paying job, or in
Inheritance.
more often well, yes, that too, or the inheritance aspect, but also, or they were lucky that they could stay at home, that they
Yes.
could work the jobs that they were working kind of post high school or post secondary education. They lived at home, able to kind of lower their expenses that way, and then from there were able to kind of save up enough that they could put it into a house, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think as a whole, hopefully people are able to see like the tons of domino effects that happen with this, right?
Come into play. Yeah.
Yeah, like with the industry as a whole, and just what it means for even just society, right? Like if like you're able to rent, right, and you have like a half decent salary, there are people that make way less money than you, right? And you're already living paycheck to paycheck. Well, that then means then you're having that many more people who are now potentially like homeless, right?
Correct.
Or potentially living in unsafe living conditions, right? And that has an effect, again, regardless of what you have going on in your own individual life. That's going to have effect on society and
As a whole.
where you live, right? Yeah. And ultimately it's going to be a negative impact, right? Regardless of the fact that you can kind of close your door at the end of the day, so to speak, and shut off from the world. But the reality is things are going to, the cost is going to catch up to you.
Yeah. Some way or the other.
One way or the other.
Yeah.
Right. And the only last thing that I kind of want us to touch about, because we did talk about it in the first time recording this episode, is just, and I don't want to go too crazy with it because I know it can be it can spiral into a lot of other things. It's probably very much so what you and I have already discussed for our kind of part 2 or season 2 of the podcast, when we kind of look at how do we, or what kind of a world do we want to live in, so to speak. But it is a crazy thing that we find ourselves in nowadays. So you had already kind of touched upon it, that in the news and in politics right now, there's huge conversations around housing and interest rates and all these different things of the cost of living being so expensive, right? Yeah. And obviously we started the episode saying that housing in particular is probably one of the larger costs of living expenses that we all deal with.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I think last time we talked about it, I don't know if I posed a question to you or whatnot, but it was along the lines of, okay, we've just talked about all the different factors that influence the housing market and arguably influence it to make it more expensive, right? Just naturally with time and all that stuff, the supply and demand aspect, the government's role in it, cost of doing
all
business,
those factors,
banks. Yeah. The question of, okay, if we know that those things are what affect society in the housing market, how do we then make things cheaper? How do we then improve our housing arrangements? And I had said to you that a lot of the big push, and when you hear it in the news, is that we need to increase supply, right?
Yeah.
Because it's true.
Yeah.
The reality is, and we talked about it especially with zoning, right? We've really screwed ourselves in terms of the amount of supply because of the fact that, hey, we have all these people wanting to live in these places,
not enough
but
available,
not enough houses, right? The issue that I have with that in terms of increasing the supply, and again, we kind of already, you and I talked about it, but what do you do with the fact that if I build a house, right? If I'm a developer and I'm building houses, we kind of already talked about it with the cost of doing business and all that stuff. If you're still so priced out of the market, right? I can build tons of houses, let's say I can build
So
so many houses to the point that you're reducing it by, I don't know, 20%. Like what a cost of a house costs now, right? So if it's $1 million house typically today, that I'm gonna snap my fingers, build enough houses that the supply is going to increase, that house now is worth $800,000, right? So one, we kind of talked about it with the whole renting thing, that it's right now you've said, and I think that you have a normal enough salary that you're living, relatively speaking, not maybe exactly this, but relatively paycheck to paycheck. Is that fair?
yeah,
Right. And I think that there's a lot of people that would still find themselves in that, even with people with higher salaries than you, right? Because depending on where you live, if you live in Toronto and you're like that kind of stuff. So if you have all these people who are living paycheck to paycheck, right? Obviously, even if I reduce that house by 20%, the ability to have a down payment is next to impossible when you aren't
you still not
saving
gonna, it's
money,
not going to help anything.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah. And then you could say, all right, so let's just rule out all that massive chunk of the population that says I can't even save money while renting, right? So let's say we're only looking at the people who are renters, never owned a house, would like to own a house, and are able to save a bit of money, like month over month, right?
yeah.
Maybe they're on the ramen diet, or I don't know,
Whatever, yeah.
right? Like, whatever the reason they were able to do it. So now, okay, maybe they're able to accumulate that 20% down, or whatever, even if you didn't want to.
Yeah, but so what's the like? Where are we going with this? Like, is it?
So my question is that, like, so you have those people, they're trying to buy in the market. What's to stop someone who already has money, who already has a house, who already has all these other things from buying those houses?
Nothing. And we already know that's a big problem, is that there's too many corporations buying up residential land. Right? So like your Black Rocks and stuff like that, right? Which keeps the prices where they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the need for demand
whether
is
it's
still
like
there,
a REIT
because
or
the
something like that.
supply that's being created isn't actually affordable.
Yeah, and I guess So I guess you're already. It's partially probably because we've already even talked about it, but in agreement with the fact that there really is not a solution to the housing problem.
No, not without, you have to. There's so many barriers you'd have to like. First of all, the first thing you'd have to do is, I don't even know where you'd start, because first thing you have to do is give people more money.
I think though you couldn't even do that though, because unless you're saying, are you giving money only to like?
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, where do you start to determine that? Like, you have to do like a different kind of census almost.
Yeah,
right.
But then I think if you gave people more money, then that would just increase
demand.
Yeah. And then then would also have, right? You would essentially, which I don't think anyone really wants, relatively speaking to how our societies currently work, at least, you would have to make it illegal to own more than one house.
Yeah.
That no person is allowed to be a landlord. And on top of that, no business, like the business of being a landlord, is not an actual business. You would have to say that it is so much of a necessity, like a human.
Yeah, but I see it. But that's what you. That's,
slippery slope.
Well, it's not even that too. Just like to where to even start with it is like, that's a massive conversation on its own. Of like, where do you even begin to like apply the change and how?
I would make the argument though, as much as like that is where you would have to do it. And that's why I'm saying to you is that I don't think you actually could change it.
Not in the current state, no.
Because you couldn't have a society that is a capitalist society that says it's okay to make money, that it's okay to invest in and profit and all those different factors, right? Because you can ignore all the like government nonsense and whatever, right? At the end of the day, we are in a situation where there are people that have more than others, and
Well, it's not even people,
because
it's like companies.
yeah, but I would make the like so. Yes, companies obviously are going to be a big factor, but the reality is that like if I wanted to buy a second property, I could do that way easier than you could ever do
Yeah,
that.
yeah. There's a seal. Like, yeah, it's once
Right?
you're in
Like
that ceiling, it's fine.
I have
Yeah,
a house, so then I can like leverage my own house.
yeah,
Like I don't even have to earn more money. Like I could
yeah.
literally just say, go to the
There's the
bank.
value.
I want
Yeah,
like a home equity loan type of thing, and I'm going to take that and buy another property. And like, oh look, these houses are cheaper because the government and everyone got on board to build more supply. Well, guess what? I'm going to buy it, and I'm not even special, right? Like I'm probably bottom of the barrel when it comes to that kind of situation. Like versus people who are a lot older than me who have been paying off houses
but
for a long
then it
time.
just goes to expose you, which we're trying to do here, Dave, how bad it is, like why the situation
Exactly.
is the way it is, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah. There's a reason why we've chosen to have this conversation around the housing market
Yeah,
relative to like why the world is the way it is, why maybe we should talk about how we should change our world. But yeah, I think the housing market is a great example because it does really epitomize a lot of the kind of like economic stuff that we've been talking about,
yeah,
as well as just the like kind of human decency, human good, those factors that also are kind of playing into and essentially like are clashing with each other, right?
exactly.
But yeah, I think I don't know unless there was anything else. If it's okay with you, I think we can wrap things up and end it there.
Yeah, no, it's a good.
Yeah.
It's a good conversation.
Yeah, I know. We're leaving it, I guess, a bit on a not a cliffhanger, but like, well, sucks to be you in life type of situation. But hopefully, you're able to take that more in the sense of a way to maybe question your world in the sense of, yeah, it's pretty messed up because no one is talking about the fact that there isn't actually a solution to the housing problem. A lot of people are saying build more houses, we wouldn't have this problem. And I would make the point, and I think you would make the point, that that does not solve the issue, right? You essentially would have to say people should not want to live where they want to live right now. You would have to go way out there to where no one wants to live, and that's got to be a new demand-oriented place,
Correct.
right? That would be your only other solution.
Yep.
But it's again a band-aid solution because if you build demand somewhere else, eventually
It's gonna
it'll
go
like
away, or come
be
around.
this,
Yeah.
yeah, or that demand will get out of hand, just like it does in places like Toronto and the GTA and so forth,
You go
right?
back. Yeah.
But yeah, I think on that note, we as always appreciate you guys listening to us ramble away, and hopefully you learned something. Hopefully that you're able to take something away from this conversations, and maybe have some conversations with your people in your own life to really question your world around you.
Yeah.
But with that being said, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. Together we are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview.